Hi, I'm Jeffrey, and right now we're going to talk about Paul's letters in the New Testament. Now, the New Testament is the latter part of the modern Bible, the first part being the Old Testament. Old Testament was a group of sacred texts to the Jewish faith. New Testament deals with the story of Jesus and the story of the first generation of Christians. Now, there are 27 documents that form that New Testament, and 13 of them were written by a gentleman named Paul. So, let's take a look at who Paul was and what his contributions to the New Testament are, shall we? So here we have Paul. Paul is what we would call an apostle, which is a term for a special kind of leader in the early church. Apostles were people that the Christians believed had the authority to speak on Jesus' behalf. And so the apostles were the ones talking about what should Christians be doing? What should Christians believe? They were primarily responsible for carrying on the story of Jesus and his teachings. And so Paul is one of these folks. But Paul's a little bit different from some of the other apostles. Most of the first group of apostles were close followers of Jesus before he died. These are folks like Peter and James and John and Philip. Paul wasn't one of those people. Paul became an apostle after Jesus had already died and rose again, and the church was beginning to spread. We meet Paul when he is a Pharisee, which is a religious sect of Judaism that opposed Jesus. And Paul was not a fan of the Christians at the start when we meet him in the Bible. In fact, Paul was rounding up Christians to throw them in jail. However, he had an encounter with Jesus after he had already risen from the dead and converted to Christianity. So the story goes, and you can read about that in the book of Acts. Paul, after he encounters Jesus and becomes a Christian, he becomes a missionary. And so he takes it on himself to take the story of Jesus to various cities and areas of the Roman Empire. And so he has founded churches all across Europe by the time the New Testament closes. And a really interesting thing that we should know about Paul that makes it relevant that so many of his writings were preserved in the Bible is that later on in the New Testament, by the time the second epistle of Peter is written, Christians are already beginning to think of Paul's letters as Scripture. Now, Scripture was the word that Christians and Jews in the first century used to refer to the Old Testament. These were much older sacred documents. But by the time 2 Peter is written, Paul's writings are also being considered Scripture by Christians. So it's really interesting. So let's take a little bit of a look at some of the features of Paul's letters. We have 13, possibly 14. We'll talk about that in a second. So Paul's letters, because he wrote so many, they can be identified by their first word. Paul introduces each letter with his own name. He says, Paul, and then sometimes he'll say, I'm an apostle, or Paul, and then he'll just say, I'm writing with this group of travelers to these folks. Paul is the first word of Paul's letters. And his letters include some things that you'll see as you read each one of them. He includes prayers for his readers very commonly. He answers questions. Sometimes Paul's letters are in response to letters that other Christians have sent to him. Remember, he's an apostle, and so he's supposed to be giving direction to the early churches. And so sometimes he's sending responses to questions that people sent to him. He's also addressing issues. Christians weren't very popular in the first century. You had opposition from other groups of religious folks, and you also had opposition from Rome. The Romans weren't all that keen on the idea of Christians claiming that there was a different king, King Jesus. Paul talks a lot about things that Christians should believe. This is where he brings in a lot of his knowledge of the Old Testament. And then he also talks about things to do. He lays out a good deal of commands and instructions for the early Christians to follow in order to just set up behavior expectations for Christians. You know, what should a Christian life look like? His letters also have a lot of greetings, and so because Paul was traveling a lot, he often included greetings in letters to different parts of the Roman Empire because he had friends all over. Now let's take a look at the specific letters of Paul. We're going to look at two big groups that Christians tend to divide Paul's letters into. Of these letters, they can generally be lumped into two groups. One is letters to churches, and the other is letters to individuals. So the letters to churches, this is where the majority of Paul's writings tend to go to. So we name Paul's letters after their readers because he wrote so many. When you look at some of the later epistles in the New Testament, like 1st and 2nd Peter, or 1st, 2nd, and 3rd John, those letters are named after the people who claimed to have written them, or after their attributed authors. But it would be kind of weird for us to have 1st, 2nd, 3rd, 13th Paul. So we've named Paul's letters after the folks that he sent them to. So to churches, the letters to churches are named after where those letters were sent. So the letter of Romans was sent to Rome. Makes sense. Ephesians was sent to the people at the city of Ephesus. The two letters of Thessalonians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, were written to the folks at Thessalonica. Some areas got multiple letters, and so that's where the 1st and 2nds come in. And so 1st and 2nd Thessalonians are the 1st and 2nd letters that Paul wrote to the Thessalonians. Pretty simple. So the list there is Romans, 1st and 2nd Corinthians, Galatians, Ephesians, Philippians, Colossians, 1st and 2nd Thessalonians, and then this is where that possibility that Paul could have written a 14th letter comes in. For about 1,000 years, the book of Hebrews was generally grouped with the rest of Paul's writings. Now, we're not really sure if it was written by Paul, because for one, it doesn't begin with Paul. But it's fair to say that there's a lot of Christian tradition that has said Paul wrote Hebrews. So it's not generally considered a Pauline epistle, but seemed worth it to note. And then Paul also wrote some letters to individuals, and these letters are named after who received them. So you have 1st and 2nd Timothy. Those are letters that Paul wrote to a younger pastor who was kind of his protege. You have the letter to Titus, that's another church leader, and then a letter to Philemon, or Philemon, and he was a leader in an early church as well. Each of these letters deal with different issues that these church leaders were dealing with, and also things that Paul wanted these church leaders to know and remember and do, to pass on this church leadership and build strong churches. So, you can see how Paul's letters were really important to the early church, and they're still important to us today. Paul's writings about about the Old Testament are still really useful for Christians who want to study the whole Bible. Paul's letters to individuals are very useful for people who want to become pastors or enter some sort of leadership-oriented ministry. And of course, his letters to churches are good for all Christians to take into account because we're all part of Christian communities, and it's good for us to know how an apostle who spoke on Jesus' behalf expected Christians to behave and what he expected Christians to believe. So that's Paul's letters. Enjoy reading them, enjoy studying for yourself. I make a lot of videos like this. You can hit subscribe to see more, or read more about this on overviewbible.com. Thanks very much.